Okay, so we are commencing this morning at Lamed Aleph Lamed Beis near the bottom. We're picking up from the previous Mishnah. The previous Mishnah enumerated a number of different circumstances under which there are certain responsibilities or I should say differences of view, of opinion as to whether or not a finder, someone who is obligated under the pasuk to find, has a responsibility, and whether or not he can claim money or what he can negotiate. So, in other words, it isn't just one size fits all. If you're a finder, you have to go ahead and fulfill the mitzvah. There are nuances to the mitzvah, and here this Mishnah, as well as some of the others, goes through those details. So, one of the details that the Mishnah told us was that if you are a poel, you're a worker, and you receive let's say you got a day job for 5 dinar to pull up trees and roots. It's a hard work, but 5 dinar is a lot of money. And all of a sudden, there is this opportunity to do the mitzvah of the Shabbos Aveda. What's your responsibility if you have a responsibility to yourself, to working? So says the Mishnah that this potential finder can go to the owner and say, I will put aside my work, but I want the wage that I would get if I were working all day at my other job. So says the Mishnah, if there is a bastion in the neighborhood, meaning in the jurisdiction where he's in, he can go to that bastion and he can make that demand. And the bastion in turn says to the owner, you have a choice. You either hire him for the money that he's requesting, because that's his loss, he's allowed, or you don't get him. So those are the words of the Mishnah, 3 lines from the bottom. If there is a bastion, then he has to work through the details with the bastion, and however it works out, that's what the compensation is. So there's an interesting, what unfolds is an interesting story. Iser v'Rav Safra, 2 Amorim, Iser and Rav Safra, besides being big Talmidei Chachamim and sitting and learning, also were business partners. So Iser v'Rav Safra Ovid Iske B'Hadei Adori, they did an assay, they were in business. And also Rav Safra Paligle Blodate de Iser. So Iser wasn't around, whether he was away or whether he just wasn't there at the time. And let's say for argument's sake, they were splitting up a commodity. Let's say it was wheat. They were splitting up wheat. So Rav Safra wanted his chelik. So Rav Safra came and Paligle Blodate de Iser. And he split up the wheat without the knowledge of Iser, ba'apebe tray, in front of 2 witnesses. So the Chari, you think that's perfectly fine. There's 2 witnesses. They see 100 bushels, 100, bushels of wheat, and he's taking 50, and he leaves 50 for Iser. It couldn't be more simple, right? It seems like a very straightforward transaction. And then, okay. Also, so Iser found out about it, and he was very upset. And they came before the Gadol, Rabbi Huna, and he said, "What's going on here?" Rav Safra went ahead and made this division without me in front of 2 witnesses. So what did Rabbi Huna paski? Omale zil isa tlosa the polik kamaydi. So the first thing he said is, go find the 3 people before whom you did this chalukah. Of course, he didn't do it in front of 3, he did it in front of 2 witnesses. So what's he saying? He's saying, go bring me the bastion upon which you relied. Inami, he gave him another alternative, Lamed Beis Amid Aleph, Trey Migo Talasa. Bring me 2 of the 3 who say, yeah, we were part of this bastion of 3, and we saw what happened, and we supervised, and we said it was fine. The Inami Trey Sadi the Palge Ba'apa Beitlosa, or a third alternative, he said, bring me two witnesses who can testify that this chiluk, this split, was done before three. So he's giving him three alternatives, but what are the alternatives? The alternatives all have to do with a three-man bezdin. In other words, find two of the three, or have two people say it was done before three. But three is the magic number, not two. So he asked him a kasha. So you're telling me that you could do ba'apetray. That's not the case. Omalei. So Rav Safra then responded, Menolachai. He said to Rav Huna, he said, what do you mean? You're telling me it has to be done in front of three. Where do you know this from? It says Al Tishnai made him Yakim Dava. So how can you, Rav Huna, go ahead and say you need three? Omalei, it's not. We have a Meferish Mishnah, in Yesham Bezdin, Masna Bifnehem. Quoting our Mishnah, that if there is a Bezdin, you have to be Masna Bifnehem. Ein Sham Bezdin, Nipneim Yasna. That's the rest of that Mishnah. Who do you negotiate with if there's no Bezdin? Says the Mishnah, Shalo Kodem. No, if there's no Bezdin, then he can say, my assay, my work comes first, and I don't want to take what you're giving me. Either you give me what I ask, or else I go back to my own work and I am, and then I'm free from doing anything. So what's the cashier? So the cashier is that you had a case of a division of property, and Rav Safra said, I did it in front of two witnesses. What's wrong? Two witnesses are always acceptable. Comes Rav Huna and says, and he brings him three alternatives for how he should have done it. In each case, he's saying it should have been done before Bezdin. So that's the emphasis. The emphasis is that whatever you did, you didn't do it the right way. So if you can bring me proof that it was done before Bezdin, I'll accept the fact that you did it, even though Sumchus was not, even though Isser, even though Isser was not there, I will allow it as long as you can prove that it was done before Bezdin. So Rashi on the top, Trey, Migo, Tolosa, Shnaim, and Ashlosha, Yavar, Yidolom, Shlosha, Hainu. We were three, and here's two of the three. He said that's okay. But in Yesham Bezdin, the Stam Bezdin, Shlosha, Alma, and Kirch Lahachim Mammon, Zeh, Eitzel, Zeh, Pachas, Mishlosha. So you see, you have to have three. So where are you coming from two? So that's his kasha. So that's what the Isser brought this complaint. Now, so the Gemara is going to give us an answer. Amalei. So Rav Safra says, "Mi dami." How could you compare our Mishnah to this case where I have a split of property with the Isser? Hossam the mapik memona nehai most of lahai in Bezdin. I grant you, when you're taking money from one person and giving it to the other, you have to have a bezdin. What's that? In our case, you want to hire a worker. It means that worker is going to get money from the owner. So in order to create a proper setting for that kind of transaction, I agree, you have to go to bezdin. Bezdin has to give its approval and say, and that's pshat masna bezdin. Bezdin says to the owner, he wants 5 dinar, you want to give him 2, he doesn't want to take 2. So you have to reach an understanding. That he says, I understand. Abu Chacham, the day shakla, he's taking his own. Gila milsa ba'almahu, betray sagile. So he's making a chilik and said, the case of Isser and Safra was not a case of one person taking and negotiating something that wasn't his, and therefore they have to have an arm's length negotiation. It was an objective split of something that everybody knew was there. Everybody knew there was 100 bushels. The only question is, did he take 100 fairly? Or was there some kind of maybe something that went on there that wasn't so right? So if you have two witnesses who say, yeah, sure, if Safra took 50 and they looked identical to the other 50, and there was no problem, there was no question. So he's arguing that a bezdin does not apply in a case where the transaction is merely just splitting property that's already there that everybody agrees to, and it's not a negotiation of something new. So that's the chilik he wants to make. Something new requires a bezdin. Okay, then, so if the finder says, I want 5 dinner, then 2 witnesses alone isn't going to do anything. You need a bezdin to say, give its imprimatur, yes, you agree to 5 or 4, whatever it is. But simply dividing up the property is betray. So that was Rav Safra's answer why he did not accept Rabbi Bar Huna's psak on this particular situation. Teda, and I'll bring you a raya. He says, I'll bring you a raya that I'm right, says Rav Safra. Why? The Tanan. Okay, so we have a following halacha that when a man dies, then his widow is entitled to her chelik of the ksuba. And that's how it works out. But if she doesn't take her ksuba or delays taking her ksuba, she's also entitled to what we typically would call the nichse malug, or part of the estate that belongs to the children, for which she does not get a chelik normally, because her chelik is the ksuba. And once she's paid the ksuba, then she's sort of out of the picture. The family gets the rest. As long as she delays getting the ksuba, she's entitled to get something from what we call the nechasim of the isomen, meaning from the greater estate. So almana mukeres shelo b'fnei bezdin. An almana is allowed to take her chelik even without bezdin. Says Rashi. Gila Milsa Shiyoda Shachalkim Almana Hanizonas Menichsi Yisomim Mocheres Lemizonas Shalo Bezdin Bilvat Shiru Shneim Shalo Timker Bazul. Oh, so all we need are witnesses to say, you know what? She went ahead and she sold XYZ part of the estate, and from that, she sustained herself. So 2 witnesses are perfectly fine to say that she did that, and she didn't undersell it, she didn't make any tricks or anything like that. So in other words, we have a situation where she's allowed to do it, and you don't need a bezdin. So he's bringing that as a raya. He says, Teda, look, we see the farish that an almana can do that without having to go to a bezdin. So why are you saying we're going to and there in that particular case, we don't know exactly what she's taking, right? It's a little bit more like the case of the finder, because she's taking not a sort of standard chelik, she's taking a chelik, whatever she's taking from the nichse yisomin, whether it's 5% or 7% or 4%, but as long as she does it right and no trickery, it's okay. So you see that you don't need a bezdin for that. So that would be the proof that Rav Safra is bringing that Shtei Eidim is okay. On Malay, Abaya, okay, so the Chayra, he's right, he should be right. On Malay, Abaya, V'lavmi Itma Allah, didn't we learn on that particular halacha, Amr Rav Yosef, Rabbi Yumi, Amr Rav Nachman, Almana ein tzricha bezdin shel mumchin, abel tzricha bezdin shel hadyotis. So he says, no, it's no raya, because that case of Almana where she took from the Nichse Yisomin, you don't need experts who can evaluate the value of the property, et cetera, but you do need a bezdin of 3 hedyotas. So he's slugging it up and he's saying, no, you still need a bezdin. This is a different type of bezdin. It isn't an expert bezdin who can evaluate the property, but as long as there's 3 people there for a bezdin, it's okay. So in other words, what he's saying is you have no raya from that situation that that 2 is okay and that you don't need 3. So it seems like there's a machlokes here as to whether or not 3 we know we need anytime you're about to actually enter into negotiations, like in the case of the finder. Those for sure you need 3. The real question is, do you need 2 or 3 to rubber stamp something that is not complicated, but it's just a transaction. So can you transact in front of 2, or do you need in front of 3? We know that the halacha, the Maisa, most, I mean, I would say a very small percentage of matters in Jewish law really come before Bezdin. So as a practical matter, the bastion does not get involved in most, let's call them business transactions or transactions where there's an exchange of property. That's usually done with Shnei Eidim. But certainly a bastion should be consulted or should be involved where there's going to be some serious negotiation between two people, and it requires the imprimatur of a body. Two witnesses alone don't have that sort of reputation or that kayach to be able to come and say, yes, you have to give him 5 dinar instead of 3 dinar or something. So that's
Rabbi,
yeah.
I've got an issue. I mean, these are business partners. This is normal transaction amongst business partners. In other words, they're selling goods that they have to sell, and he decided to divide them up. He brings in 2 witnesses to make sure that it is being done in the proper way, that there's no advantage either way.
Right.
So why do we need to go to a bastion to conduct a transaction that is part of the partnership?
Well, again, the Gemara seems to be telling us that there are levels of sort of grades of how we should comport ourselves in business, and it's telling us as a general rule that if you're a businessman and you and your partner have to come to terms on something that you're working on, it would seem that 2 witnesses are sufficient to be able to oversee that kind of split. It's when one person wants to be motzi mechavero. In other words, I have a taina. We are both independent businessmen. And you come to me and you say, I want to negotiate a deal with you. And you say, yeah, okay, but I want 5 dinar. And you say, but I'm only going to pay you 3. So this is fine. So for 3, I won't do the work. I'll find other work. So that becomes more of a contentious thing, not just, okay, we're going to find a way to sort of divide what we both agree we have. We just have to divide it fairly. So for fairly, 2 witnesses are good to oversee something that should be fair. But when it comes to subjective negotiation as to whether or not I should subvert my time to you for less than what I want to take, that I don't want to do. So in other words, there is that subtle line where you go from agreeing but just seeing that the agreement is fair to actually negotiating and having to come to terms on something that you don't want to pay, but I want to receive.
So if the issue here is how much we pay to get the work done, can't you get a rendering post facto as to how much, if there's a disagreement between you say 2 dinar and I say 5 dinar is acceptable? It's not the issue of you distributed property unfairly, or that was your property or my property. It was even as you're conducting business, unless there's a specific proviso that says that, this should not be sold or divided until we discuss it further. So I don't understand why you can't make the decision if it's talking about paying the workmen, why you can't do that after the fact and come to an agreement to, if you have to go to bastion after that between 2 dinar and 5 dinar, they can render a decision post facto.
Well, I think, Michael, you hit it on the head, is that we want to avoid machlokas, because once the deal is done and now we have to fight over money, now it becomes even more messy because they already did the work. So now it's a question how much you should be getting. We want to avoid that.
But Rabbi, practically speaking, if you're conducting business and you're 2 partners can opine and make decisions on behalf of the partnership. You can't say "Mother, may I" every time you have to have a transaction. So it's a judgment issue, and if there's a problem with that judgment, then you can seek adjudication afterward. But it just doesn't make sense to me that you stop in the middle and you have to go through a bastion before making this decision.
But Michael,
Mike, can I jump? Rabbi, can I jump?
You said the magic words. Partners. They are already partners. Now they just have to sort of smooth out and iron out their agreement as partners. A finder and an owner are not partners. They are 2 separate individuals who come together. They have no connection to each other. In that case, it has to be done in advance with a bastion because they are not partners. Partners,
sorry.
Partners, I grant you.
So were these a finder and owner as opposed to partners? I thought you said partner.
There's two different cases here. There's a case of two partners, Isser and Rav Safra, one case, and the other case is the case of the finder with the owner. So the Gemara wants to conclude that that the partners can live with two witnesses because they are partners and they are overseeing. You're right, whether it's before or after, how they work. But
I'm
partners.
sorry, I
Right,
misunderstood.
but the finder and the owner are two totally independent people, and they're arm's length negotiation. For that, he said you need a bezdin.
Rabbi,
I get it.
but to Michael's point, looking at the case of the two partners, it seems like the case is not about a regular business transaction, but it says that they decided to the time of the partnership was expired. In other words, they're terminating the partnership
They want to split the property, right?
and splitting the profits, as opposed to, like Michael was saying, a regular business transaction. Two partners enter into a business transaction. You don't need the basting for that. But here the partnership is ending, and now it's time to divvy up the underlying assets.
But there's an objective way of determining fairness. And what the Gemara is saying is that an objective way of determining fairness can be handled by two witnesses. You don't need a bezdin because all they're doing they're counting bushels. And unless, for instance, he took 50 bigger bushels and he took 50 smaller bushels, they'll be able to say, no, it wasn't a fair division because even though he took 50, he took 50 big ones or small ones. That's all within the purview of witnesses. And he says that's perfectly fine. But once you have to enter into a negotiation to agree on a fee or on a sum or something else, that's already outside the scope of two witnesses and falls into the category of a bezdin, that a bezdin has to now step in and opine and say, yes, this is you should do this or not do this. So in other words, he's making a chilek between what's already there, but just has to be sort of accounted or clarified, which is fine for two witnesses, or now we're entering into what is more of a serious negotiation. Should I do the work? Should I not do the work? That's a whole different story. For that, he says you have three witnesses, and then he wanted to bring a raya, but you see by an almana that she can go ahead and do the latter, meaning sort of the negotiation part, and still only have to have two witnesses. And she's okay. Says Abaya, no, the Gemara didn't mean that she could do it in front of two. She has to do it in front of three, but they don't have to be expert witnesses. They can be just three people off the street, so to speak, who are, not specifically knowledgeable in business, but you do it in front of them. That's considered a bezin hedyet, not a bezin mumcha, and that's okay. So Abaya concludes that we're consistent. When we need a bezin, we need a bezin, even if they're not experts. And when we need two witnesses are sufficient just to testify that Rav Safra didn't do anything wrong when he took his 50 bushels and left the other 50 for Issa.
So by the almana, she just needs to present a star to three hedyotos. I mean, is that it?
Say it again, the almana what?
By the almana, all she has to do is present her star, but to the hedyotos, to the
right. She just has to say
it.
to the hedyotos, this is what I did, and they can sign off. Exactly.
Okay.
There doesn't have to be.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
But again, just going back to the case of Issa and Rav Safra, I thought the conclusion was that where they're terminating the partnership and one basically took his share without the other one being there.
Right.
That in that case you required a basting because who was it?
He said two.
Rabbi Huna said, so where bring us the basting, bring us the three people, bring us the basting, give us the name of the basting that you used, and the answer is he didn't have a basting, he only had the two witnesses.
Which is why Rav Safra pushed back and says, I don't need a bezdin because all I did was split something that we all knew was in front of us. So Rav Safra was arguing on Rabbi Rav Huna, and he was saying a bezdin is not necessary in that case. Two witnesses are sufficient. And he was the one who brought up the chilek. When you need a bezdin? You need a bezdin when you're negotiating
a deal. Got it.
One word there, I think you said terminating the partnership. They weren't terminating the partnership. They were dividing up that crop of grain.
That property, right.
Different, no, but not the real property. They weren't from the text here, I don't think he wasn't saying, oh, you know what? This is the end of our partnership. We're going to harvest this. And then
They had done a business transaction and they wanted to each take their chelik of the.
they were taking their chelik of the profits and so
Right.
on, not that they were
Yeah,
dissolving the partnership, because that might really require a base. There could be other issues there.
Well, again, as long as everything is in front of you and you're counting for fairness, then we're saying that witnesses are sufficient because no one is. It isn't a situation where one has to negotiate with the other. If, for instance, there was 50 bushels of differing sizes, and Rav Safra said, I took 2 of these and 5 of these and 10 of these and 10 of these. There might be an argument that he is doing something more than just splitting it down 50-50, and you need a Besdin that would actually weigh in. Although it's not 100% certain, because the point of the 2 witnesses is to make sure everything was kosher, that there wasn't something improper happening. And if Safra just took more or less 50 and left more or less 50, then we're saying that that's fine. He didn't do anything wrong. It's when you get into the weeds, when you start saying, well, I don't quite agree to this. I wanted this chelik, I wanted that chelik. So there is a sort of a line. There is a line of demarcation between 2 and 3. And la halacha today may not be as clear, because I'm saying again that most transactions do not occur before Besdin. We know that as lawyers, we write a document, we have it signed by witnesses, and the document, let's say it's a split of property. That document is sufficient. You don't have to go in front of a Besdin to get an imprimatur that we were able to transact business and we split our property. That just doesn't happen today. So for the most part, we're dealing with witnesses, and we say but when it comes into the more complicated areas where it does require a Besdin, because now it becomes a little bit more contentious between 2 people. It's not just simply, yeah, we agree, we have 100, we split 50. Now we have to negotiate, we have to agree, and we have to come to terms. There, you need that higher level of integrity. Not that 2 witnesses aren't of course they're honest, but you need that 3rd member of the Besdin to sign off. So he's
Rabbi,
making,
in the halacha in this particular case is what? Do we need 3 witnesses, or do you need a formal based?
okay, so in the case of the splitting of property that's already in front of us, it's just a question of my taking mine, you're taking yours. 2 witnesses are sufficient. No
Okay.
question about it. But if it's a case of, well, as in our case, for instance, I want X dollars for my service, and I won't do the work without it. There, we need the imprimatur of Besdin to come along and say that you are entitled to that amount that you asked for, and we're going to give you that benefit. So in a negotiation where there isn't an obvious your chelik, my chelik, in other words, it's become subjective, then we need a Besdin.
Is there a materiality concept? If it is de minimis, do you still need a based-in?
I don't know that there is such a thing in Jewish law. In other words, when the setting is a setting for Besdin, then I think it is regardless of amount or quantity or anything else. It's just the framework of how we should proceed. So if it's 10 bushels, if he's going to do the work for 5 dinar or 10 dinar or 1,000 dinar, in other words, that shouldn't play a role on whether or not you need the weight of a Besdin. It's the whole approach to what you're doing. Okay, so that's the end of that interpretation. So now we're going to go to the new Mishnah, but basically we've now sort of parsed even further how a finder who wants to help, but he doesn't want to lose his own advantage, has a right. So we see that there are rights, even though it's a mitzvah in the Torah, and we're going to talk about that now also, even in the next Mishnah, that even though there's a halacha that you have to pashev tashev, you have to do the right thing, you still have flexibility in how you go about doing it. Okay, so that's the end of that Mishnah. Says the Mishnah on Lamed Beis Amud Aleph, and here we're turning sort of the clock back a little bit. Says the Mishnah, Motza berefes ein chayiv. ein chayiv bo. If you find an animal in a barn, says Rashi, "B'gemor mafarish my itzvah." The first thing Rashi says is, "What are you telling me? We're so far beyond that concept. Why are you telling me if you find it in a barn, you don't have to chase after it? It's there." I mean, that's so 1A of finding of mitzvahs. So the Mishnah says, the Rashi says, we're going to have to understand why he's saying that, because it's patently obvious. What's a berefes ein chayiv bo, rishus harabim chayiv bo. So these are generic, very general statements. If you find an animal in a barn, you can assume it's not lost. You don't have to immediately bring it to the owner. But rishus harabim chayiv bo. You make an assumption if it's in the rishus harabim that it is lost. So these are general comments, and we'll understand them in a couple of minutes. Okay. Weiter, next. Again, generally speaking, if the animal was walking around in a cemetery and the finder is a Kohen, lo yitame lo. He should not be mitame in order to retrieve the animal. So again, here you have a conflict between what is a mitzvah on the Kohen not to be mitame versus a mitzvah of a Shabbos Aveda, and again, there's more detail, but we'll get to the detail. And so the Mishnah says, "Lo yitame bo." In Omalai Oviv, if his father, who obviously is a Kohen, because he's a Kohen, says he tame, go ahead, go in there and be mitame and take it out. Osha Oma lo al techzor, or he says, you know what, you can grab this animal and you don't have to return it. Lo yishame lo. He does not have to listen to his father. And now, what's the issue? The issue is kibbut avein. You have a mitzvah in the Torah of kibbut avein.
I mean, this is all very interesting stuff because we generally have a principle, assay, v'dachi, los assay. So these are all mitzvahs assay, and the prohibition of a Kohen going into the cemetery, that's a los assay.
Right. So I'll give you the preview and remind you that we had a Gemara a couple of weeks ago, which may be germane here, that lo asa assay v'docha assay v'los assay. Do you remember we said that an assay is docha a los assay, but an assay is not docha an assay and a los assay. So when you have a combination of an assay and a los assay, then a simple assay cannot be docha.
Where's the and you're saying this might be germane here. You're suggesting where's the assay and los assay here?
Okay, it says hoshev tishivein, that which is an assay, right?
Oh.
And then it says lo sucha lehisalein.
Okay.
You can't look away. That's a los assay.
Okay.
You have an assay and a los assay.
Okay. All right.
Right. Just a reminder because that comes into play here. Okay. So
But
anyway,
could you also have sort of the other direction for the Kohen? He's not supposed to become Tame, which is a los assay, but also if he becomes Tame, he can't do all the assays that he's supposed to do.
but a Kohen also has an assay and a los assay.
Right, that's what I'm saying. It goes both sides. You have assay and los assay.
Well, again, so we're going to see here in a minute how this all plays out, because these mitzvahs that combat each other, it's not so simple, right? In other words, how do you weigh one mitzvah against another mitzvah? Well, the Torah tells us that all mitzvahs are shava. It's not for us to say one mitzvah has more kiyum or more clout than another mitzvah. So how do I know that the mitzvah hoshev teshiva, it is bring back a shluch hakein? They say a mitzvah kala. Mitzvah kala is to do shluch hakein. So can I sort of say, shluch hakein, I don't have to do it. I'd rather, it's more important that I do a more important mitzvah. Who are you to say shluch hakein is not an important mitzvah?
Well, of course, the other side, though, then it gets the question whether you'd have to pay somebody to do and all, which we talked about that.
Right.
Is that in theory, a Kohen could find a Yisrael and say, hey, you be my shaliach to go ahead and.
Absolutely. Yeah. To do that. Absolutely. All right. So that's why Rashi was smart and said at the very beginning, now is not the time to parse all of this. Let's get all this out and then we'll have a discussion. Okay. So weiter in the Mishnah, no, okay. Porek v'ton. If now remember we said that when an animal is carrying a burden and then it falls under the weight, you have a here. Then this, remember we had two psukim in the Torah that we went through, Hokim Takin and Azav Tazav. So Porek v'ton, what happens if you did the mitzvah? You went ahead and you unburdened the animal and made it easy for him, so you did the mitzvah. Then he gets up and it falls down again. So says the Mishnah, Porek v'ton, afilu arba v'chamisha pamim chayiv. You're chayiv on this mitzvah. You can't say it's one and done. I did my deed. It was Porek v'ton. Now I can move on. If it fell again or again, the Torah is telling us that that mitzvah is repetitive as many times as it takes to get it right. How do we know? Shenemar Ozov Tazov. Because it says Ozov Tazov. And Ozov Tazov, we said, does not have a limitation. Doesn't mean Ozov Tazov one time. It's Ozov Tav is one of those words that you can't determine if it's a singular or a plural. It says Ozov Tazov. So it could be one time, two times, five times, we don't know.
Rabbi, what happens if by doing so, he does it 2 or 3 times, and then the animal is so overloaded that he damages his legs now? Now he's of no use to anybody. So why would you force it to do it if he keeps falling down? That must show that it's too heavy for him.
That's a very good question, which we'll discuss that in a couple of minutes when we discuss the question of whether or not this animal is carrying the proper weight of what it should be. You're hitting on something that the Mishnah and the Gemara want to talk about. In other words, is the weight appropriate for the animal, or have you overburdened the animal and therefore it's impossible for that animal to carry that weight? That's a valid question. It's a very good question.
Not necessarily just that. The fact that if you load him up again 2 times or more, and he still drops, that is evident that the animal is suffering from something other than just his mere strength to carry that object.
Right, absolutely. So you're right. That comes into play. That's part of the fact.
So can you do this unilaterally, just by observing it rather than with the reshus from the owner? Maybe it's implicit in this discussion. I don't know.
There too, we're going to touch on. These are all good questions because we're going to be touching on things that sort of trigger these kinds of issues. I mean, if you're watching this animal and you see it walking and walking, in other words, you happen to be on the highway and you're trailing after this animal and it's walking for miles and miles and miles and carrying this weight. So clearly it's able to carry the weight. It's not as if the weight is too burdensome because you've been watching this animal for the last half hour. All of a sudden, the animal collapses, and the goods that it's carrying falls down. So, yeah, you could say, it went about as far as it could, and now it's too tired, or the burden slipped, or you can come up with maybe other reasons why it happened. So the Torah says, Ozov Tazah, you can't just leave it lying there. You have to do something. The question of what you do, that's a little bit more subjective. And everybody has raised a good point. What happens if the animal finally fell under the burden because it wasn't the right burden, or maybe this animal isn't, cut out to be able to carry this? So these are all valid questions that I think we're going to try to answer by analyzing what happened and what the responsibilities are. Nobody knows other than whether this animal is capable other than observation. You don't know. You can't ask the animal, is this too heavy for you? I mean, if the animal is walking along for miles and carrying it, it's obviously not too heavy. All of a sudden it falls. You could say, why did it fall? Did it fall because it finally got to be too heavy, or because somehow the strap loosened and the balance wasn't correct, and all of a sudden it fell because if you balance it, it could go for another 100 miles, but the balance wasn't good. So we don't know that. And because we don't know that, we're saying that there are certain responsibilities that a person has. Now, when it says Porek v'ton, that means that one of two things, as we just said. Either the balance wasn't right, or this animal can no longer carry that weight. He did it for half an hour for 10 miles, but now he can no longer carry it. He's spent, he's gone. We don't know that. So those are the questions that sort of are raised by this Mishnah by telling us Parak Keton, that yes, at some point you're going to come to a decision. This isn't working, and now we have to figure out why. But just because you did it one time and the para starts walking and then falls again, doesn't mean that you can say, I did mine, I was Parak Keton, I no longer have to do it. Says the Mishnah, no, you still have an achrayus. We still have to get to the bottom of it. We have to find out why this is happening, and maybe he should be exempt because at some point it's not going to work. It just simply won't work. But we don't know it at the time.
Doesn't the observer therefore have a responsibility to investigate? I mean, it could be the load shifted, or even inside a box, something shifted. It's not so easy to determine why the animal sat down.
Right. So you're asking a question which is bordering on even something else. Who has the responsibility here? Is it the owner or the helper? In other words, the fellow who has the mitzvah, or is it the owner who has the achrayus to finally determine what's going on with the animal? Because it's not his animal, it belongs to somebody. That person has-
Any stranger who sees this event would also be dragged into maybe he has to do something.
Right. Okay, so
I mean,
let's hold all.
Is
Yeah.
that correct, that the achrayus goes beyond the hired help and the owner?
That, okay, valid. Now, okay, so let's look at the next line of the Mishnah, because these are all questions that come up now when we're discussing this scenario. Now, what happens? Okay, Shenema Ozav Tazav, Halach v'Yoshev Lo. The owner is walking with the animal, and he stops and he sits down, and he says to the person who's standing there, who was watching all this, Va'omer hol va'olech mitzvah. Since you have a mitzvah of Parak Keton, of Ozav Tazav, im ritzon chalifro Parak Potter. So now the owner is saying to this fellow, you know what? I'm going to sit here on the side, and you go ahead and fulfill the mitzvah. I don't have a mitzvah. I own this animal. I have no mitzvah with this animal. You have a mitzvah of Parak Keton. So I'm going to sit nicely on the side, and you're going to go ahead and do the mitzvah. Says the Mishnah, Potter, the person who's standing there who wants to help has no responsibility to do anything. Shenemar imo. It says the word imo, meaning with him, that he has to help the owner to be Parak Keton. If the owner absolves himself from doing it and says it's on you because it's your mitzvah, then he does not have to do the mitzvah. That's what Jay?
How can the owner say, I don't have a mitzvah to do it for my own animal?
No, he doesn't have a mitzvah because the mitzvah is specifically directed at someone who sees the event and comes in and helps. That's what Ozav Tazav on its face is directed not at the owner, but at the person who should come and help. So if he's coming to help the owner, he gets a mitzvah. If the owner says, I have no achrayus. Now, wait a minute. There's another line here, which we'll get to in a second. But if he says, I can do this, but since you have a mitzvah and I don't, I'd rather you do it and get the mitzvah. You go ahead and get the mitzvah. It's a big mitzvah. So he's going to absolve himself from doing it. Now,
But doesn't the owner have he's the first person who has the mitzvah to take care of the animal and make it work?
Except that it's not the mitzvah of Ozav Tazav. He has an achrayus on his own
Regular
his property. But the mitzvah of Ozav Tazav was directed at someone who will step in and help.
Okay.
Now, but the
thank you.
Mishnah,
Right. In this case, it's even more complicated because previously when we dealt with Azov Tazav, it was in Dvorim, where it's about your neighbor's animal. Where it looks like they're quoting here from Shmos, where it's your enemy's animal. That makes it-
even an enemy, right. In other words, Right, yeah, you have to take your enemy's animal and take care of it. So your enemy isn't about to help you, load it. Right, exactly. Aber but if the owner was a zaken or a chole, and he says, you know what, I really can't participate in this event because I can't bend, or I'm not feeling well, then chayiv, the bystander is chayiv, right? He is chayiv to do it even without help from the owner. So what have we learned here? We've learned that the mitzvah, the outside mitzvah of Osov Tazov, is a mitzvah that's directed at someone other than the owner. And in normal circumstance, he would be helping the owner, and that's perfectly fine. If the owner can't do it for reasons of medical or other things, no problem. But if he chooses to say, I'm not going to do it, I'm going to put the whole achrayus on you, that he may not do because of the word imo. Okay, so up until now, we more or less have sort of balanced our Mishnah, and we understand the different parts of the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah goes weiter, and now it's going to get a little bit more complicated, if it isn't already. Okay. So the Mishnah says, mitzvah min Torah lifrok. Okay, the Tanna Kama says there's a mitzvah in the Torah lifrok. What is lifrok? Lifrok means that if the animal falls under the burden, that you have to undo the burden and take care of the animal. That's Osov Tazov. Avalo liton. According to this Tanna Kama, you do not have a mitzvah to reassemble the goods and put it back on the back of the animal to let the animal continue on its way with its goods. So this Manda Omar, right, says that there is a difference between Prika and Te'ina. We're going to see in a minute what the challenge is. Rab Shimon Omer Afliton. No, there is no difference. Prika and Te'ina, taking off and putting on. Now, we learned last week, and we saw from previous Mishnahs, that there are two psukim, right? Also Tazov, Hanek, Tanik. So, l'chayra, we do have a source, a Torah source for Te'ina, but according to the Tanna Kama, here, it only applies by Parika, not Te'ina, and Reb Shimon says, Af Liton, that even to put it back on is a mitzvah. And Rashi says right away, Avalo Liton. Okay, but Gemara Mefarish. So in other words, again, the Mishnah is deferring the explanation to later on, because on the surface we already know from previous Gemaras that Te'ina is a mitzvah in the Torah. So how can you come and say Avalo Liton? Okay, fine. So the ambiguity will be explained because there are a lot of subtleties here. That's why I say this Mishnah is opening up a lot of different issues for us, and we're discussing some of them. Rabbi Yeshua Lili Omer, Im Hoya Olav Yesa Amaso, and I think this goes to David's question, because what happens if he was not, if it wasn't the proper burden? Im Hoya Olav Yeser Amaso, if this animal is capable of carrying 50 pounds and they loaded him with 75 pounds, Ein Zokiklo, he does not have to help. Shenema Tachas Masao, that it's the beast fell under its burden. Maso sheyochel lamedbo. It has to be a burden that it can carry. So if you are overloading, let's say, and because you want to take advantage of not having to hire a second animal, then you can't have an expectation that someone is going to go ahead and help, because again, it's the subtlety of the word of what it means. So it has to be proportionate. 50 pounds, okay. 75 pounds, that's already too much. Can't expect it of the animal, and therefore you have no achrayus. So
Rabbi,
this Mishnah really opens up a lot of questions, a lot of different areas, and we're going to take them one by one, and we'll start with the first one right now. but you already see from the discussion of the Mishnah that there are a lot of nuances and a lot of different cases here. And the questions that came up this morning clearly indicate that we're having some trouble here. How are we going to handle some of this between the owner and the finder and the helper, and whether or not the animal is what's shot that the animal fell down? How many times you have to pick it up? You pick it only if it fell down, not if you pick it up. All of these are valid questions, and we're going to get to all of them. So we're going to start. Go ahead, David.
Aren't you obligated though, if it is overloaded, to, if you don't want to unload the whole thing, don't unload it, but at least take off enough where the animal doesn't suffer at that point? Because if it's overloaded, it's suffering, and
Right, but you're not the,
I'm not going to do it.
right, but you're not the owner. So who's going to decide what to put on, what not to put on? The owner's standing there, and he can't do it himself, and you're helping him. So it's the owner who, if anything, the owner's going to say, "Don't put this back on," or "Put this back on." But if the here, the owner is saying to the guy, "This animal can carry it. Do it all. Get it all back on."
Right, the Mishnah presumes that it's not an unreasonable load. The
He'll say,
Mishnah
yeah, he'll say
presumes
it's
it's
not
not.
unreasonable.
Yeah,
He'll say it's
it's
not
not, so
unreasonable.
it would say also it's not Sarbali Chaim. It would imply also, I guess.
Okay, good point. Now we're getting into issues that we're going to discuss. Exactly. Is it Tsar Balachayim? Are you allowed to do that to the animal? Valid questions. I mean, this Gemara really opens up the door to a lot of questions. But you're right. So
We tell you that it's not heavy enough. He wants to get it, everything.
he wants to get it to market. You know what? It's about the profits, David. He's got one animal. He wants to get it to market. He wants to sell it all. He doesn't want to hire a second animal and lose profits, because now he's going to split the cost between two animals instead of one.
Yeah, precisely. That's why there should be more of a stringency on it, because you know he's going to overload the burden any which way you look at it.
Yeah.
So it should be an obligation that you have to take something off regardless.
Yep. Again, we're in the real world. Now we're trying to figure out what's allowed, what's not allowed. Let's just do the first part of the Gemara, because the first part it starts all very interesting. The first part of the Mishnah said, what did it say? It said if you found it in a barn, it's not there's no Hashavas Aveda because it's okay. You found it in Rishus Rabin, Chayev bo, because it is a Hashavas Aveda. Says the Gemara, Amar Rava, Refesh Amru, Eina Misa'ah. The barn that we are talking about is not a barn that would push the animal out. What does that mean? So Rashi tells us right away, Refesh Amru Sheshaninu b'Mishnah Seinu Asiking Kishe'ena Maso Esha Behema Shebesocha Lios Boreches Liotis. There's no reason why this animal should flee from the barn. What does that mean? It has plenty of food, it's got water, it's warm enough, it's comfortable enough. In other words, it's not the barn that is pushing the animal out because the animal is uncomfortable in the barn. The barn is fine, right? So he's telling us that if you have a barn for which a normal animal would have no reason not to leave, you can consider that to be not a find, and you don't have to touch it. The Eina Mishameres, and also we conclude that this barn is not locked. It's not locked. Says Rashi, the Eina Mishameres she'eina ne'ula. It's not locked. The emboss letzes yotza, and it's easily able to go out on its own. Now, so the Gemara says, how do you know that? How do you know that it's a normal barn and it's an unlocked barn? So the Gemara says, Eina Misa'ah, it's not, it's a normal barn, meaning it's a comfortable barn. Because the Mishnah says that in a refes, you're not chayiv to return it to the owner, it must mean that the barn is an okay barn. Because, by the way, if you come across an animal and it's in a barn that's cold and wet and dirty and has no food, that's as much as saying that that animal is lost. You have a responsibility to save that animal, even if it's under the roof of such a barn. So if the barn is warm and has food and has water and is comfortable, by definition, it means it's not lost. That's the definition of an animal that's sitting comfortably in the barn. And I'll make the point in a moment. The Eina Mishameres, and how do you know that it's not locked? It's the Mishnah Eina Chayev Bo, because the Mishnah has to tell us that you're not chayiv. Why does the Mishnah have to tell us it's not chayiv? The teretz is because it's not locked. If it was locked, the Mishnah wouldn't even have to tell us that you don't have to return it. Of course, you don't have to return it. Now, let me remind ourselves that I think it's last week or the week before, we made a chilik between a Shabbos Aveda and, for instance, someone who steals and has to return to the owner. What did we say the halacha is? You have to go to the owner, take the stolen item and put it in his hand. You got to give it back to him. Masha Ein Kain, by a Shabbos Aveda, you can go over and put it in his garden, or put it in his barn, or put it in his Daled Amos, as long as those Daled Amos have walls and are protected, i.e. a barn. So in other words, if I find an animal and I happen to know it belongs to Chaim, I don't have to go to Chaim and say, Chaim, I found your animal. I take the animal, I bring it into the barn, and I fulfilled my obligation because the barn is a safe place.
Right.
So you see that by Hashavas Aveda, a barn is sufficient. This Gemara is only telling us what kind of barn. If it's a barn where the animal would not normally run away, why? Because it's got the creature comforts and it's okay, then you're fine. Then you don't have a mitzvah of Shabbos Aveda. If it's a barn that's unlocked, that's also okay because it doesn't have to be locked as long as it has four walls. And now the animal can walk out, but that's not your problem. Your problem only is to see that it goes back into, quote, a safe place. So he's telling us a barn is a safe place, even if it's unlocked, as long as it has enough for the animal to sustain itself. It's not dirty and dark and cold and wet and everything else. So that's very important. That's pshat in the, he's giving us a definition. Now, why do we say that? We'll finish. The isol kedatach mishmeres. If you're going to say, okay, let's just say no, that's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to make sure that it's a locked barn, that it's actually guarded. Then I'm going to ask you the following question. Hashda mishkach lo abroy, milo legave, mishkach le megave meboya. Now that we said that if you find this animal roaming around and you brought it into the barn and the barn has walls, that's sufficient. Is it, if you find it in the barn itself, it's not sufficient. In other words, the fact that it's a quote safe place means that it doesn't have to be locked. It doesn't have to have shmira. It just has to have a protected area. So if you bring it into a barn, it's a protected area. So he's saying, madach, if you find an animal roaming around and you want to return it, you don't have to go to the actual owner. You just bring it into the barn and you fulfilled your mitzvah. Now that you find it in the barn, of course you fulfilled your mitzvah. So that's how he concludes. And he says, El shmamina, eina mishmera shmamina. So he comes to the conclusion that we don't have to have a locked barn because even an unlocked barn is sufficient to meet the standards of a Shabbos Aveda. Remember, a Shabbos Aveda has a different standard than Geneva Aveda, where you actually have to return it. When you steal something, you have to return it to the owner so he should know I have it. That's the mitzvah. Shabbos Aveda, you don't have to return it to the point where the owner says, oh, I have it. Because it's a mitzvah on you to return, not necessarily a mitzvah that the owner needs to know that it is in his Daled Amos. That's the halacha of a Shabbos Aveda. You fulfilled yours, and now he should be patrolling his property. Oh, my favorite cow is back. So someone was able to find it, and I thanked them. He may not even know who did it, but anyway. So let's see Rashi and we just said right before, right? The ginoso, we said he can return it to the garden, or even to his property that isn't, particularly built up. Okay. Okay, so that will be the next Gemara. We're going to talk about Tchum in a minute, but in any event, what we see from here is that the mitzvah of Shabbos Aveda has a low threshold. Therefore, if you found it in a refes, if you found it in a barn, then as long as the barn is in reasonable shape, even if it isn't locked, then you do not, there's no greater achrayus to return, and you're okay. So that's the first interpretation of this Mishnah. Mitzvah, next week, we're going to get into a more complicated question, comparing Refes to Rishus Harabim, a barn to a Rishus Harabim, and we're going to see how the Gemara requires. Anyway, this is very consistent with everything we've been learning till now. There is a mitzvah, the Torah does put a mitzvah on a finder to do Hashavas Aveda. No question. That's a mitzvah that you have to consider your friend's money as valuable as your own. And you can't just say, oh, it's not my money, I'm not going to bother with it. Torah says, and you have to do for your friend as you would do for your friend, for yourself. However, the standards aren't quite the same. In other words, yes, you have to return it, but now we go to degrees. So what's my achrayus? How far do I have to go to fulfill this mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda? What we're learning and what we've seen today from the different Gemaras is that there is an achrayus, but it isn't to the nth degree. You have to do what you have to do, but at some point you could say, I've done mine. I fulfilled the mitzvah. Now, sometimes you have to go the extra mile, like parak v'ton. Okay, you have to do it more than once. But there are other times when, I find the animal, I'm rushing off, I shoo it into the barn, and I'm off. Now, the animal can come right out of the barn. I mean, you don't even have to lock the barn behind the animal. That's, but at least you have fulfilled the basic mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda by making sure that animal is in a safe surrounding. If that animal happens to run out again, okay, then it does. And someone else will have to be employed. You don't have to stand guard now and wait for the owner to come back and make sure that he has his animal. But there is a balancing test, and somehow our questions are good because they're testing that balance. They're asking, so how far is that achrayus? What is it that guy really has to do? So we have to come to some kind of a balance and say, adkan, that you're responsible, but you're not so responsible that it becomes, the central thing in your life. Now, or for the rest of your life, you got to be a shomer for that other animal. That we don't do. Okay. So,
Thank you, Rabbi.
yeah. Okay. So we finished here. Mitzvah. Next week we'll pick up. And again, it's fascinating because these are actually real-world questions that we're asking for our own, for our own responsibility. If situations come up, how do we act?